Welcome to the Deep Dive Book Club podcast. I'm Joel.
I'm Leo.
And today we have a special episode for you. I would normally give our nice little intro, but we don't need that right now because we're going to deep dive into a nice literary device. What's that? Is that something fishy I smell?
Yeah, I thought I smelled something. A
bit different, like I said, about what we normally do, which is about a single book. We're going to be looking at a series of books, a bit of history, a bit of context, and some real-world examples, and kind of get into the red herring and its use in literature, as well as its application for fallacies.
We got this idea meeting up with our in-person book club. We were having a discussion completely unrelated to literary devices, and this just came up in our discussion of The Idiot by Dostoevsky, which will definitely be an upcoming episode. Lots and lots of stuff to talk about there, but
probably a three-parter.
At least a three-parter. We'll see how many parts this gets broken up into, how we slice the fish, so to speak. But today we are not covering a specific book. We are talking about the literary device, the red herring.
So, Leo, tell us what a red herring is.
I'm glad you asked. So a red herring, to my understanding, I'm not even going to look at the show notes here. To my understanding, a red herring is when the author tricks us by saying, hey, look at this. This is the thing you're supposed to pay attention to. And then, surprise, that wasn't the thing you're supposed to pay attention to at all. It was a false trail, a trail sign that was meant to literally mislead you to pay attention for stuff. And we'll jump into some examples that we've encountered personally as we get further along.
We can see it rise, especially in detective-style movies and novels, and it's been used intentionally, unintentionally, and we're going to have a great time diving into it. With that, Leo, let's get into the use, the history, and maybe the future of the red herring. And perhaps the beginning of the red herring is a red herring itself. Do you know what the actual red herring is?
I don't.
Neither did I until I deep dived into the history of the red herring more than I probably should, reading page after page and trying to actually discern the real history of it. So, a red herring, there is no fish that is a red herring. It's simply a kipper. Kipper just means a flayed or spliced open fish, and it's usually pickled or smoked, cured, and it gives a red appearance, and it has a very powerful smell. Leo, I put in a picture of a kipper for you here.
That does look tasty. I do like sliced and smoked and fish almost any way.
So where does the term red herring come from? As a history lesson, it holds a fun story, and trust me, I spent a lot of time reading through a whole bunch of different papers and articles, and there's no fully agreed upon history of the red herring. So we're going to go through story after story, and let's make our own conclusions and decide what we think is the most likely origin.
It looks like the very first time we see in English the phrase red herring, it comes from a poem called The Treatise by Walter of Bibsworth.
I love the name Bibsworth.
That's fun. That might not be how it's pronounced, but it is fun. It published in the 13th century.
Roughly, it has letters we don't even use anymore and spelling we wouldn't even use anymore, but basically he ate no fish but red herring. Herring red, really. So, if we fast forward, Leo, during the 16th and 17th century, Britain found the upper class riding across the countryside in search of some good sport. Hunting foxes drew away the dreary days of boredom, but alas, what is a good hunter without his horse and hound, Leo?
What is a good hunter without his horse and hound, Joel?
Well, in the countryside of Britain, he wouldn't have a fish or a fox. So he definitely has to rely on these. And in this English author and poet, whose name I will absolutely butcher, Gerard Langbaine, not even sure if I said that anywhere close to right, he published The Hunter, a Discourse of Horsemanship. In this work, he discussed the use of a dead cat or red herring as a tool to train the horses to follow the scent of the fleeing game, specifically, of course, foxes or rabbits. They wanted the horses to be laser focused, so they would drag the fish near or on the trail to distract the horse away from the fox or the rabbit, and they would reward the horse if the horse stayed on the right trail and continued down following the fox or rabbit trail rather than the super smelly, pungent trail of the red herring or a dead cat. This is very unlikely to work in my opinion, since we don't have any blood equines, and humans don't have anything horses really want enough to be trained. And this only comes from back when I worked as a search and rescue member. We don't have any scent trailing horses.
I've not heard of a blood equine.
You know why you haven't heard of a blood equine? In the same way you've heard of a bloodhound?
No.
We don't have horses that track people or animals or anything else by smell.
That makes sense. I don't know why a horse would need to be good at hunting by scent.
You know what? Because
the
horses
things
aren't
they
hunters.
prey upon don't move.
They don't move. Unlike dogs, which we have trained to be scent trailing. I've never heard of like a trailing horse in terms of scent trailing like we have a dog.
You don't think ruminants and herbivores can go and get good at tracking things by scent?
No, and the other thing about that horse trainers in rescue told me is they've tried to have their horses get trained to find people, but the only people that horses get good at finding are the owners, and I think that's only because the horses know the owners keep them alive or help them get food. And personally, humans just really don't have anything that a horse wants bad enough for them to let you train them to do things that are a little against their nature.
Right. They want to run and do sporty athletic things. They don't want to hunt things down.
But we have the exact same story about horses being trained to follow the fox or rabbit as we do to train a dog, which makes much more sense to me. The Oxford English Dictionary's current entry for the figurative sense of red herring points to a reference of Nicholas Cox's The Gentleman's Recreation, published somewhere around 1697. And in there, we see the suggestion to train hounds to follow the scent of a fox or rabbit by using a red herring. Now, there are some differentiations that we can find here when we're referring to this 1600s, 1700s use of red herring. And in some of the stories I was reading, the red herring was used to train the dog. So you run the red herring along the trail of the fox so that the dog starts following that, and then you remove the red herring so that the dog's like, oh, well, I smelled this other scent, the fox, with the red herring, so let me follow this trail. And then the other one that I often hear it referred to is you train the dog to follow the fox, and then you run a red herring across a fox trail to distract the dog, and the dog is supposed to not follow the fish. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
What do you think would make more sense to be real? Because I read both.
Using the red herring to get them used to tracking, or using the red herring to obfuscate the trail?
Exactly. Those are the two stories I've read multiple times as the origin of using the red herring.
I don't know that there's one that sounds more true than the other. Both sound equally plausibly apocryphal and also something that someone could have done when trying to train a dog. Training a horse, I don't know how that went for him. I would love to learn more about that.
I'd love to know.
I could see both sides. This is just completely apocryphal, or this is something that, hey, it's going to be easy to track this fishy scent that I've dragged through the woods a lot easier than a fox. And then let's reward you for the behavior for following the trail that I know that's already there. It looks like you also found some much more likely apocryphal origin stories.
Almost for sure apocryphal.
Anecdotal, fun reasons people came up with for red herrings. One being that animal activists would use red herrings to purposely distract the hounds and obfuscate the trail to protect the foxes.
Yeah.
I like that explanation.
It was a fun explanation. I found it in multiple places, but almost nowhere could I find like an original text or it linking to an original thing that was written down.
I would love to find a story of someone who did that. Well, what about the red herring? What about the herring? You know, you're using one dead animal.
You're using one dead animal
to prevent another dead animal. And then the other one you found was with prisoners. Prisoners would, when they're about to do their daring escape, they would ask to be fed red herring to use that to distract hounds.
Again, almost certainly fiction, but a nice, fun idea. It's like one of those like too good of a story to actually be true.
I don't think logistically it'd work out, because if you're handling the red herring, you're like, okay, I'm going to leave the herring here to distract the hound. You've already got the herring on you for the hound to keep following, and the hound knows I'm hunting down a human.
Right. It's never going to work. I believe it was Dan Carlin, and he was talking about, we can't always be sure of ancient sources, but when sources get repeated again and again, it kind of gives more credence to the authenticity of that history, right?
Right.
And so that's what we're going to run into here with, again and again, I found this particular author and passage referenced. And it comes from an English journalist, William Cobbett. And this was in 1805. He claimed that as a boy, he used a red herring to mislead hounds following a trail, but he used this as an extended metaphor for his London press periodicals. Here, basically, he really upset a lot of people because he only published political satires, and the use of his word red herring, or his phrase red herring here, is the first time we really see it referencing a misleading piece of information.
Metaphorically.
Yes, exactly, metaphorically, not as in a literal, here's a training manual for dogs or hounds. I found, the date 1805, 1807, and I really just think it was different editions for the publications, but it was all famous articles, and if you look up the history of red herring, this is probably going to be the main one that you find, and he talks about dragging the red herring to throw off the fox's scent. He was meaning it to disparage false news coming from France at the time.
So he's essentially saying that France, hey, this news coming from France is purposely misleading.
Exactly.
Just like I used to use a red herring as a boy to obfuscate the trail.
Exactly. That's exactly it. I used to do this as a kid, and they're doing this now. It's a red herring. That's 100. You hit it exactly the way that I wish I wrote it down in our show notes. But this is the scanned page of the first time we see red herring used in an extended metaphor to mean misleading.
Okay, so I'll read this excerpt. When I was a boy, we used, in order to draw off the harriers from the trail of a hare that we had set down as our own private property, get her to hunt early in the morning and drag a red herring tied to a string 4 or 5 miles over hedges and ditches, across fields and through coppices, till we got to a point where we were pretty sure the hunter would not return to the spot where they had been thrown off. And though I would by no means be understood as comparing the editors and proprietors of the London daily press to animals half so sagacious and so faithful as hounds, I cannot help thinking that in the case to which we are referring, they must have been misled at first by some political deceivers.
Thank you, Leo. That was really good lowercase o Old English reading that you gave us here.
This is also an extreme run-on sentence. That was all one sentence.
That was all one sentence. And the sentence before this, if you wanted to give it more context, was a page and a half, as you saw me crop half the page before this.
It's interesting just from a writing standpoint to examine the way they wrote. I would love to look at more samples from this time period. Looking at this more critically, I'm noticing that commas are used kind of in between the way we use a comma and a period now. He's got a period in this sentence, which is ending the sentence, but he has commas that separate
that are basically
periods that function like periods. So maybe this is meant to have more of a pause on all of the commas, but there's a lot of commas and clauses that are kind of nested within the sentence. Very interesting writing. Okay, so that is our first metaphorical use of the term red herring that is popularly found in historical writings.
Potentially our best conclusion for the origin. Now,
and this is a good candidate for it, like you're saying, because he is explaining the metaphor here. Because he is explaining it, that means it's not in popular use, but it's there enough from the historical snippets you found of apocryphal ways people probably used red herrings for him to use it metaphorically, but he still needs to add an explanation to his readers.
Exactly. Misleading, political deceivers, all of this, adding that all together. So it's probably the best origin we really have for metaphorical red herring. Have you ever seen Mythbusters?
Joel, I have seen the show Mythbusters.
I haven't seen this particular episode, but I did find snippets of this episode. In episode 148 of Mythbusters, they tried using the red herring myth and seeing if it would work. Although the hounds used in the test stopped to eat the fish and lost the fugitive scent temporarily, it eventually backtracked and located the target, resulting in what they considered the myth to be busted, because the hound would get off the trail, eat the fish, and then go right back to the human scent.
That makes complete sense. I am not surprised by that. That's perfect dog logic. Hey, let me take a detour for a tasty snack and then get back to my job.
Yep, get back to your job. That makes sense to me. That's great. All right, let's take a quick break. When we get back, we will get into categorization of the red herring. As a hard scientist, I enjoy a good separation into nice, neat groups, arbitrary or not. So how do we categorize the red herring? Let's make a very simple diagram of 3 circles. One massive one, the general red herring, and 2 smaller ones we'll get into. The general circle, the red herring, at the base is just meant to mislead or misdirect the target. I use the word target here, and it's synonymous with audience, but because we're going to get into narrative and fallacy, I like the word target a little better. Narrative is super easy to categorize, and we're all very familiar with it. Think about Sherlock Holmes stories where we have clues that obfuscate the real solution to the murder. Detective movies where someone is a suspect and they're clearly put there to mislead you, or anything else. And really, a red herring adds to a good mystery story, detective story, and it is very useful not only for detective novels, but also useful for adventure and fantasy as well, where we have misdirection, and we're going to really deep dive into those. But I think narrative is relatively straightforward. Wouldn't you say, Leo?
Yes, when you're saying narrative, you mean used as a literary device within the structure of a story itself. Yeah, so a red herring as a fallacy is under the heading of fallacies is what would be called an informal fallacy. A formal fallacy would be one where there's something wrong with the flow of the logic itself, but an informal fallacy is something is wrong with the content or context of what is being said. So an example here would be an ad hominem attack, where, John says the sky is blue, but John is a bad person, therefore the sky is not blue, using just a flaw in the actual context of what's being presented. It doesn't make sense to use someone's character to disparage evidence that may or may not be related to them.
And that ad hominem would be a type of informal fallacy.
Correct. Yes, that's an informal, because it's just introducing irrelevant data. The flow of the logic is not broken at a mathematical formal level.
So can you give what you mean where we have formal fallacies are a flaw in logic and informal fallacies are a flaw in reason?
So let's think about it this way. Logic refers to structure, the actual structure of what is being argued, and that could be just the way the argument is laid out, whether in words or in mathematics. But an informal one, like I said, is content or context. So an example of a formal one, so part A would be it's raining. Part B of the argument would be the ground is wet because it's raining. You can't then, it would be a break in the structure to say because the ground is wet, it is raining, or it just rained. That's a break in the logic itself. It doesn't flow both directions. So that's an actual formal breakdown in the logic.
A means B, but that doesn't mean B means A.
Correct.
Makes perfect sense.
Informal fallacy, another example besides ad hominem would be straw man, where you make the poorest possible case for someone else's argument. Well, you're arguing for the destruction of the environment, therefore you are, that's just a terrible argument, so I disagree with your argument. You're making the worst possible version of their argument, therefore making it easier to attack. So the red herring as a fallacy is a little bit more ambiguous than the way it's used narratively. Narratively, it makes sense, but a red herring, when we're referring to it as a fallacy, is where you're introducing evidence to mislead an audience, or, like you said, the target. You're misleading by specifically introducing irrelevant data, irrelevant news. So a politician, we've all seen, satirically, politicians will say, hey, I don't want to talk about this, so let me introduce this thing. Well, what about the immigration problem? Or what about the tax problem? Or what about this? And another way to talk about this is, whataboutism. So it's just distraction. It's politician level distraction. Hey, don't pay attention to this other thing. Pay attention to this irrelevant piece of information. Keep you distracted. Typical politician behavior.
So you're telling me one of the manufacturing plants here in America produces a product with red dye 40, and they even have the stuff to make the product without red dye 40 that they sell to Canada in the same factory.
Correct.
That's crazy to me. Pulling that back to using it as a red herring, right? So an example could be red dye 40 clearly has health concerns, and the response being, we're committed to customer health. That's why we're actively removing yellow 5. That would be a red herring because you're misdirecting or trying to get away from the main question. A generalized rule to measure things against for red herrings is, even if the statement is true, does it help answer the original question or goal? Or was what was said a non sequitur?
I think that's a pretty good way to summarize it. Is this a distraction? Is this, never mind whether it's factually true or not, like, what does this have to do with the original point? What does this have to do with either the story or the argument or the conversation or the goal of an activity? Is this a distraction? Is this a false signpost to take me down a trail that I don't want to go down?
Great. Okay.
But the thing about red herrings is, when they're done well, they do their job. They distract us. They pull us in.
Okay, now with that, we have gotten into the two categories of red herrings, and I really want to dive into some real-world film and literary applications, because after all, we're a deep dive book club focusing on books and the use of the red herring. Let's get right into it, Leo. Bringing to the forefront right now, one of America's most famous late 20th century examples for red herrings is Nixon. Leo, would you believe that we can find examples of red herrings within the Nixon presidency?
Why am I not surprised?
Oh, man. Very briefly, Richard Milhous Nixon was president from 1969 to 1947 when he resigned. One of the leading causes of his resignation was Watergate. Watergate refers to a collection of illegal activities done by Nixon's administration, including wiretapping phones, bugging politicians' offices, and notably breaking into the Democratic Party headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. Nixon, at the beginning of the story, denies anything actually happening, and then he denies the significance of the event, and finally he denies his involvement until everything comes crashing down. Leo. David Frost was a journalist, and he was interviewing Nixon in 1977. They had a long discussion that was all recorded, in which he brings up questions as to whether Nixon was involved in the Watergate scandal and all of that. So, when pressed for the reason why he hid facts or anything like that, Nixon had some quotes for us. Would you please read Richard Nixon's quotes that he had?
Obstruction. Well, of course. I'm sorry. You probably have read it, but possibly you might have missed it, because when I read it many years ago, and perhaps when I was studying law, although the statute didn't even exist then because it's a relatively new statute, as you know. It's just a nonsense statement.
Nonsense
He
statement.
also said Nick said, and this is Frost asking Nixon, you were part of a conspiracy after the June 23rd conversation. Nixon's only answer was, you would say that. I would disagree.
So these are some quotes I pulled up here. And the reason I had this is kind of because it shows the red herring, because he tries to obfuscate the truth and he tries to misdirect, and he starts talking about law school, and Frost kind of keeps trying to press him to actually answer the questions. Now, it's hard to get direct verbatim quotes that really give that red herring because it's often more ambiguous. It's more nebulous, and it's broader context, almost in a way that we just saw that clip where we have press releases or information releases that kind of hide the real truth, right? But I thought that was a great example. Okay, another real life example I wanted to share with you, Leo, which I think is going to become its own podcast episode because I went far too deep into the rabbit hole trying to get this, and it was just too big of a concept. Let's explore a central question. When did we know that tobacco was bad for us, specifically smoking and cigarettes especially? And how long did it take for us to do something about that?
Okay, so you want to take us down the tobacco rabbit hole. Let's set the stage and look at some of the history here. In 2022, archaeologists uncovered what is currently the earliest known evidence of human tobacco use. The discovery was made in the Great Basin of the western United States and dates back roughly 12,300 years. For many Native American cultures, tobacco was a plant of enormous significance. When Spanish explorers arrived in the Americas, they quickly took a liking to the tobacco they were offered, and the practice spread rapidly across Europe and America. Before long, tobacco had become one of the most sought-after commodities in the world. Its demand helped reshape economies and trade networks. Tobacco became one of the major drivers of the Atlantic triangular trade, linking crops, manufactured goods, and human beings across 3 continents. During the 1600s, 1700s, and into the 1800s, plantations devoted to tobacco appeared throughout the mid-Atlantic and southern colonies. Because much of its early use was passed down through oral traditions, tobacco was often regarded as a medicine and was used to treat a variety of ailments. Most people consumed it through pipes or chewing tobacco, while wealthier individuals often preferred cigars. Whatever the method, consumption was relatively limited by today's standards. But, as we're about to see, that was about to change.
So when we think of smoking nowadays, Leo, probably the easiest image that comes to mind for the modern day person is a cigarette. Cigarettes, though, were niche and not often consumed since they had to be hand-rolled, and honestly, at that point, just put it in a pipe. That changed with good old industrial automation. James Bonsack patented his automatic cigarette-making machine approximately in 1881, and companies could go from 40,000 hand-rolled cigarettes produced in a day to over 4 million. Suddenly, anyone could be a smoker now, and as much as you wanted, maybe even a all-you-could-smoke. With cheap production, the next step was getting as many customers as possible, which became even easier as colored lithography revolutionized advertisement in the late 1870s. Insert colorful, catchy slogans, advertisements, and free cigarettes given out along with endorsements from movie stars and athletes. You now have a wide range to really target the population to get them onto your product. My favorite is they were able to get many endorsements ranging from dentists, doctors, athletes, movie stars, and Leo, I'm going to share with you, they even had endorsements from babies. If you scroll down to those pictures, Leo, I'd love you to respond to the images now.
There is an old-timey advertisement here that's got a baby who is saying, "Gee, Dad, you always get the best of everything, even Marlboro." And there's a cheesy little excerpt of a guy saying, "Yes, you need never feel over-smoked. That's the miracle of Marlboro." I don't know it. I don't even know what that means.
What a great question.
Let's see, what else here? Another one that has a stereotypical looking doctor looking very pleased at a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes that he's holding. And it says here, 20,679 physicians say Luckies are less irritating. And then I guess this is the catchphrase for this brand. It's toasted.
So, Leo, we have the rise of cigarettes. We have millions and millions being produced a day now, super cheap. So I wanted you to take a guess as to what the first landmark research paper linking cancer to tobacco is.
I'm going to guess the 20s.
Earliest one I can find was about 1931. It was published in German, linking tobacco smoke, specifically looking at cigarettes, to emphysema and cancer. Now, we have the rise of World War I, we have the Roaring '20s, all of that starts developing, and physicians start seeing an increase in lung cancer that they hadn't seen before. It was almost like an epidemic starting to bubble over. The evidence was utterly damning from the start. The earliest scientific studies that we would understand them as, that is to say, professionals or scientists or physicians using the scientific method with patients, robust data, and publishing in peer-reviewed journals, appeared, like I said, in 1931 as the earliest one, and most mentioned this were in European research publications, specifically in Germany. And without going deep into the World War II rabbit hole, there was actually some pushback where during the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, they were reducing or trying to get less smoking for German citizens due to this modern research. So, we have that developing. We have the rise of lung cancer. And in the 1940s, there wasn't as much research, I think, because most of the world was kind of distracted with something. But in the late 40s, after World War II, in 1948, the Dahl and Hill case control study linked smoking with lung cancer, citing the causation with emphysema and pulmonary fibrosis. Then in 1950, the Winder and Graham released their case control study with 684 lung cancer patients. These all had strong evidence showing smoking meant lung cancer. Specifically in the paper, they noted that cigarettes hold the strongest correlation to risk with cancer. Following this, the 1950s was full of cohort studies piling on the evidence for lung cancer, and then finally towards the end of the 1950s, almost the entire scientific community was behind the conclusion that smoking means cancer. Now, that's what I got for you, pulling us into the 1950s.
Okay, so that is our historical context for it. Let's get back to red herrings. So while the scientific evidence was mounting and the scientific community was becoming increasingly aware and ubiquitously in agreement on one of the significant risks of lung cancer, this did not deter or slow down the tobacco industry in the least. They had a good business going, so why disrupt that for something like a health concern? An internal memo from the British American Tobacco Company, written by an executive, says, quote, "Doubt is our product since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public." End quote. This was written in 1952.
The tobacco company executives knowing the body of evidence against the health concerns. We see this constant battle to fight against mounting evidence so that they could maintain their profits.
Right, in 1954, a conglomeration of cigarette companies came together and published the Frank Statement throughout the nation's newspapers. The Frank Statement to cigarette smokers reads, quote, "We accept any interest in people's health as a basic responsibility. We believe the products we make are not injurious to health."
Notably, it's not exactly a red herring because it's saying that we don't think our product is injurious to health. Not technically a red herring, just refuting. So let's look at what actually is a red herring here. Later, a trade association named the Tobacco Institute started in 1958, later became the Council for Tobacco Research. Now, Leo, I would posit to you, and maybe you can add your opinion here, that the name itself would be a red herring.
The Tobacco Institute?
The Tobacco Institute, more specifically the Council for Tobacco Research. The goal was for them to sound like a research institute that looked into tobacco and tobacco health, and they only were a for-profit company that published advertisements basically arguing against health concerns.
Yes. Retrospectively, that is exactly what they were doing, and they knew what they were doing, as you can tell from the internal memo you found in dated to 52. What they might say if you called them out on that as well, it's in the name, Council for Tobacco Research. Doesn't necessarily mean we're researching health, but that is the implication they wish to give.
Exactly.
Hey, look, we're doing research. We're taking care of it.
A misleading title or a misleading name.
Right.
So now that we have historical context, Leo, we have the means, motive, and the opportunity. Let's get more into the red herring, and let's explore it in the context of the fallacy, and kind of adding in here, let's say the narrator are the cigarette companies, and the novel is the public discourse or the publications and the news articles, and the reader is going to be the audience.
And consumers.
In consumers, yes, thank you. Here are actual quotes I wanted to give to you, if you'll read them out for us. And I posit these are all red herrings.
Okay, one of the statements they come out with is that more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. And here they're relying on, hey, look, we're relying on the authority of medical professionals. Another one is, they don't irritate your throat. And that's they held many campaigns about this, implying, hey, there's no harm here. This is harmless. And then they started coming out with light and mild cigarettes, again, suggesting reduced risk despite no meaningful change in the safety profile.
And I would say, Leo, that these I would consider red herrings, right? Because they are misleading or distracting and misguiding the readers, and they're relying on authority that isn't there. Again, a little more ambiguous and gets more into the fallacy side of things, but misdirection, nonetheless.
And you've got here advertisements and publications from, I'm assuming, the Tobacco Council.
Yes, these were published by the Tobacco Council, which is why I put them here. And I think if you just read like the big headlines.
Yeah, here a headline says, not one single case of throat irritation due to smoking Camels. We got a nice picture of Camel cigarettes. There's a challenge here that says, start your own 30-day Camel mildness test today. And then you have multiple pictures of actors smoking. Here is the ABC advertisement. Always buy Chesterfield. And beautiful illustration here. Science discovered it. You can prove it. No unpleasant aftertaste.
And I added this in here because it has the ABCs, and it made me think of how much you liked Glengarry Glen Ross.
Great movie. Always milder, better tasting, cooler smoking. This is the cutting edge of 1950s tobacco science.
Yeah, it was great. You see it here, science discovered it, you can prove it, not a single case, using these kinds of words. Great examples for advertisement students here to how to market your things, right? They're using the word case when all of the publications are coming out where there's cases of lung cancer, and they're really trying to misdirect or misguide the audience here. So that's what I got for you for real life examples of red herrings. What do you think?
That is a fun deep dive into a pretty good example of seeing the fallacy version of red herring at play here, and multiple forms of distraction and obfuscation. Let's drag the red herring across the trail that would prevent consumers from getting to the conclusion that, hey, cigarettes are bad for you.
Right. Okay. And with that, are there any other thoughts, opinions you have for this, or any other real life red herring examples you want to bring up?
No, I think the Nixon one is a really good example of his behavior in general. The tobacco stuff is a great historical example that we can see that now in retrospect is very glaring, and it's easy to see in retrospect, oh, this was silly and how could they do this? But they were successful in the time that they were doing it because public opinion was already in favor of a narrative far from concluding cigarettes are bad for you, smoking's bad for you. So all they were doing is nudging people to stay on a particular trail by distracting them from the path that we are on now, where the general consensus is smoking's bad. It's just a net negative.
And we'll talk about this in just a little bit, but like I said, this is going to become its own episode because I started reading The Century of the Cigarette, and it's insane, some of the stuff they did, and I think it's going to make a really good episode for us later. With that, let us get into the literature side of things. I know I took us off on a tangent, Leo, but let's pull the Red Herring back to the original kind of collection for what we really mean, which is the deep dive into books. So getting into literature, Leo, we recently celebrated Sherlock Holmes Day, and we got to read a lot of short stories for Sherlock Holmes. And with that, I wanted to open us up with what I consider one of the classic examples of the use of red herrings. I have A Study in Scarlet, which we did read.
Okay, let's run through red herrings in literature. So, one of the earliest and most famous examples of a red herring appears in Arthur Conan Doyle's A Study in Scarlet. At the scene of a murder, Inspector Lestrade discovers the word Rache, R-A-C-H-E, written in blood on a wall. His immediate conclusion is that the killer had begun writing the name Rachel, but was interrupted before finishing. Sherlock Holmes quickly points out that Rache is actually the German word for revenge, and warns Lestrade not to waste his time searching for a woman named Rachel. But then, Doyle adds another twist. Later, Holmes realizes that the clue itself is a deception. The murderer intentionally wrote the word to mislead investigators into thinking they were dealing with Germans, political radicals, or secret societies. Holmes explains that the writing is not authentic German handwriting at all. It's what a non-German thinks German handwriting should look like. In other words, the clue is a clue about a clue. It appears meaningful, but its real purpose is to pull both the police and the reader away from the truth. It's one of the classic red herrings in detective fiction. When discussing red herrings in literature, it's hard not to mention Agatha Christie. Christie was arguably the master of misdirection. Her novels are filled with false assumptions, misleading clues, and carefully manipulated expectations. One of her most famous works, And Then There Were None, is a masterclass in this technique. 10 strangers arrive on a remote island after receiving invitations under false pretenses. Soon they discover that each of them is accused of causing someone's death and escaping justice. Then, one by one, people begin to die. The novel constantly encourages readers to form theories about who the murderer must be. Certain characters seem more suspicious than others. Certain possibilities appear more plausible than others. Christie repeatedly gives the audience just enough information to feel confident, only to pull the rug out from under them. By the time the solution is revealed, she has subverted many of the conventions readers expected from a traditional detective story. Red herrings aren't limited to detective fiction, though. They can also appear in literary novels. A good example comes from Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Early in the novel, the young Pip encounters an escaped convict in a graveyard and secretly helps him by bringing food and a file to remove his leg iron. Shortly afterward, Pip is introduced to the wealthy Miss Havisham and her adopted daughter Estella. As Pip spends more time in their world, he becomes fascinated by wealth, status, and the possibility of a different life. Then something remarkable happens. An anonymous benefactor pays for Pip to be educated as a gentleman. Both Pip and the reader naturally assume that the money must be coming from Miss Havisham. After all, she's wealthy, she's interested in Pip, and she's already a major figure in the story. The pieces seem to fit together perfectly. Years later, however, Pip discovers the truth. His benefactor is not Miss Havisham at all. It is the escaped convict he helped as a child, now a wealthy man named Provis. What's especially interesting about this example is that no one deliberately created the deception. Miss Havisham never intended to mislead Pip, and Provis had no idea Pip would associate the money with her. The red herring emerges naturally from circumstance. Both Pip and the reader make what appears to be the most reasonable assumption, and that assumption turns out to be wrong. A mark of true literary genius. The revelation completely changes how Pip understands his own life. What he thought was a gift from wealth and social status was actually an act of gratitude from a convicted criminal. Red herrings can even exist outside the mystery genre. Many readers have pointed to A Game of Thrones as containing a different kind of red herring, one based not on clues but on expectations. The novel introduces Eddard Stark in a way that feels very familiar to fantasy readers. He is honorable, capable, morally grounded, and positioned at the center of the story. He has all the hallmarks of a traditional protagonist. Readers naturally assume they will be following his journey for the duration of the series. Then he dies. His execution is shocking, not simply because a major character is killed, but because readers realize they have been relying on assumptions inherited from earlier fantasy traditions. In many stories, especially those influenced by The Lord of the Rings, central heroic characters are expected to survive long enough to complete their narrative arcs. George R.R. Martin weaponizes that expectation. The apparent protagonist becomes, in effect, a red herring. The story teaches readers that the normal rules may not apply, and from that point forward, every character feels vulnerable. The result is a different kind of misdirection, not a misleading clue, but a misleading expectation about what sort of story you're reading. Joel, you want to take us through film and red herrings in film?
Okay, those are some pretty good examples, I think, especially with the idea of the red herring coming in with mystery novels and detective novels, which I think it'd be really fun to kind of do a deep dive into the beginning of detective novels. And specifically, I think it'd be really fun to do a history of fiction and reading for entertainment itself, because in the grand span of human history, that was pretty recent, more or less. But before we get off onto another tangent of a different episode, Leo, I know all of these literary examples. I wanted to see if you had any literary examples of red herrings to bring in, because I know you read even more books than me.
Right. So with the George R.R. Martin example, what is more strongly in my mind is actually a lesser-known author named Stephen Erickson, who wrote a gargantuan, and he's still writing, a gargantuan series called the Malazan series. This is a series with sprawling narratives and a huge cast of characters in the same style here as what Martin's known for, but just on a larger scale, especially a larger time scale. And Erickson is very much a writer who, if you had to stick him in a category, you could probably stick him in a postmodernist category. And he does stuff like this. He'll introduce characters and storylines, and whole characters will turn into false trails, false leads, where he's like, hey, care about this character, and then it turns out that's not the main character, or he'll kill them off, or they will completely change due to believable changes in their context and story and life events. So, for example, one of the main central characters in the very first novel in the series ends up being a little bit following the traditional protagonist central character arc, even though there's not really a central character to the story. And then, as the books progress, completely changes. Is a completely, to use a D&D term, he starts as maybe a chaotic good alignment and then ends the story in probably lawful evil territory, to be a little oversimplistic. And it's very believable how he makes that transition, but he subverts that expectation of what the central, good character is going to do. And he is masterful at that. Other examples I can think of, even within Lord of the Rings, I was kind of thinking about this when it comes to red herrings. Think of Boromir, for example. He's introduced and he's, from Gondor, and he is meant to seem like an honorable character that we can trust in, and then you realize, oh, he is also given in to temptation, and the subversion there that happens within the same story of Lord of the Rings is interesting. Same thing with the expectation that happens with Gandalf. Gandalf's character you think is going to be one way throughout, and this is maybe an expansion of the red herring definition, but Gandalf, for example, he ends up subverting expectations because he seemingly dies in his fight with the Balrog in the mines of Moria, and then he mysteriously comes back, the same but different. Again, a subversion. Interesting stuff.
I would consider the idea of subverting plot armor as a type of red herring.
Right, that makes sense. Well, you want to take us to film now?
Sure, let's get into film, because the red herring is easily reproduced in film, and in some ways it's easier to spot it because movies are only an hour, 2 hour, 3 hours long, and a much shorter time investment. So you got to get the red herring in there faster than, say, a long, expanding series of books like you said the Malazan series is. So I think one of the easiest ones that's pretty popular for people that serves both as a book and as film would be the Harry Potter series. So easy example is Snape in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. For the entire book, Snape is presented as the villain. He's mean to Harry, so on and so forth. And then, of course, the red herring is that the quiet, unassuming professor turns out to be the antagonist rather than the clearly in-your-face, grumpy professor. And the same thing for the other books. We see this, I feel like, through most of the books, but another big red herring is the Prisoner of Azkaban, where you have Sirius Black. He's presented as one of the evil followers. He is clearly the antagonist, and he's hunting Harry to kill him. And then at the end, it's instead that was a misdirection or a misguide by the imprisonment for the evil doings he did, where he was actually sympathetic to Harry and ends up protecting Harry. And you see that both in the books and in the film. I think another classic example that was well done is, say, The Sixth Sense, where we have the idea of delusion for Cole, and in this delusion for the little kid, he's constantly trying to be helped by Malcolm, and he's like, oh, you got to stop with all of this, you're hallucinating. And then, of course, at the very end, we get the real reveal, which is that Malcolm is actually the one that's dead the entire time, and he has an acceptance problem. It's not Cole. So Hitchcock is a super easy one. Some would even say he's a master of red herrings because of the way that he developed his cinematography. Although there's several examples of red herrings through Psycho, the major one that we can see is that the main character, Norman, who is always by his mother's side, we see her mistreat him, control him, manipulate him, and the entire time it almost seems like the mother's the evil person and the character, and Norman is just this quiet, again, unassuming character. And then at the very end, we find out that he was just dressed up as his mother the whole time. He was the real killer. But there's so many red herrings, as in pointing to the mother being the bad person, pointing to the mother being the real antagonist. So, Leo, what would you say? Well, first off, let me ask, you've seen Inglourious Bastards, yes?
Yes, I have seen Inglourious Bastards.
How would you feel if I proposed to you that Inglourious Bastards itself, as a whole, is a red herring?
I think that would follow the kind of deep dive logic that I more stereotypically follow, and you're the one that has to pull me back in the boat. So I endorse this way of viewing the work.
So I would say this, as well as some of Tarantino's other works, would be a red herring as a historical subversion, because we have an assumption as to what's going to happen. In this case, we know how the real Hitler died. We're watching the movie and we're seeing this film, and because we know the historical reality, it tricks us by having the assassination attempt succeed on Hitler's life within the movie. And we can see this throughout other films and other books where we have, I guess, what we could classify as a historical subversion or a historical red herring. And then, of course, same in literature, we have plot armor, or which is something you can only really do with movies, is casting armor. How do you feel about that, Leo, for red herrings?
You see interesting examples in film where, especially in a series, where you have to keep the same actor as that character because that's who portrayed that. It's easier to change it up in animated media, but still people notice when a voice actor changes. The thing that comes to mind for me is the Matrix movie series. There was a fairly central character who dies. The actor dies between movie 2 and movie 3, or maybe it's between 1 and 2. That dies between the movies, and they have to bring in another actress to cover her. That's the Oracle character, and they have to bring this up in the film. Like, why are you different? Well, thankfully, the character is a character within the Matrix, and it's like, well, I had to change because a lot of stuff was changing, and they had to work that into the movie itself, which I thought was very interesting. So yes, this is an interesting artifact unique to movies.
Scream, and I agree with it. Scream featured Drew Barrymore, who was a very popular actor at the time that Scream came out, and we can consider this a type of casting red herring. Because she was presented as one of the main movie stars, we see the movie starting to develop, and then near the very beginning of the film, she's killed. Whereas the whole time, the first part of the movie is all following her, and we see Drew Barrymore, and she's going to be the main actress, in the entire film, and then bam, dead. I think that's a pretty good red herring because of our predetermined expectations.
Right, and I didn't see this movie when it came out, and I've only seen snippets of it, but this seems like it only would work close to the time. I mean, you could do it within the movie, but it works also with the time in which the movie comes out. It's relying on a little bit of stuff outside of the movie to assist with that.
And then thinking through, and I'm going to ask you to expand on any other red herring ideas, but I was thinking about games. I enjoy some good old video games, but horror movies and horror games have excellent use of red herrings by subverting expectations with misdirection and lead-ups. One easy example is sinister music starts to play, and we anticipate the jump. We anticipate the monster only to wait, listen, and have nothing happen. Preying on our predetermined expectations, this absence itself ends up being a red herring.
Yeah, makes sense. They do it all the time in horror games and survival games.
Yeah. Are there any other red herrings? Like, if we're deep diving, Leo, we're in our submarine and we're going as far as we can into this literary device of the red herring. Anything else you want to bring up? Anything else you want to talk about?
I could keep going in multiple directions. I mean, other works that stand out to me as far as red herrings, and you're going to have to put a lot of spoiler warnings in the show notes, and we're going to have to drop a spoiler warning at the beginning. But Ender's Game, for example, famous book by Orson Scott Card, where Ender and his friends are told that they're put through war simulations to help, X, Y, and Z later on, and then it turns out, oh, it's not a simulation. You've actually been directing the war this whole time. It's an actual war you've been participating in. You just didn't know it. Dun, dun, dun. That was the big reveal on that one. If you haven't read it. Have you read Ender's Game? I'm pretty sure you've read Ender's Game.
I don't remember.
Okay.
No, I don't read it.
Okay.
Okay.
And this is, again, we're really stretching the definition of red herring here, but one of my favorite authors,
We're deep diving.
Gene Wolfe, plays with ambiguity and misdirection at all levels. Actual misleads in the plot, but misleading as far as narration, misleading as far as the meta narrative. Just at every level, he plays with ambiguity and misdirection to create very specific effects within the reader, which I admire his masterly craft of doing that. So just a few more examples, but yes, there's many different directions we can take that.
It was brought to my attention by one of our friends, idea of Chekhov's gun as a device, which is more of a play or film device. But in a way, we could say a red herring is a Chekhov's gun that just doesn't get used. Where very shortly, a Chekhov's gun is just if you present an item or say a gun in Act 1, you have to use that item in Act 3, making writers only keep relevant and pertinent information or pertinent stuff in there.
A red herring is a Chekhov's gun that wasn't used. Hey, pay attention to this, and then didn't happen. Didn't go anywhere.
Okay, and with that, we'll take a quick break, insert some music, and we'll be right back. we are going to get into a red herring. Leo, I like to write. You like to write. Most of the time I don't write full-length novels, but I kind of wanted to get into how we can apply red herrings and see what you think, see what you feel.
So you have a guide here for doing inserting a red herring into a story.
So I was going through a couple of different writing workshops. I went to Cornell University's like literature department, things like that, and I was reading through some of their resources and kind of culminated a good collection of what other teachers of writers would talk about for applying red herring. And maybe you can kind of insert your opinions and feelings because you've read so many books. And the first golden rule that kind of came across was knowing what the truth is. You cannot write effective misdirection if you don't know what you're misdirecting from. Before you write your mystery, you should know who actually did it and how did they do it and all of these things. So think of like starting with the solution. In a way, Leo, you have built some great campaigns for Dungeons and Dragons, and isn't that really almost like writing its own mystery novel?
That's exactly what I was going to say here, is that the most relevant writing for me is creating D&D content. And for me, I go in both directions. So you're saying start with knowing what you want the story to be or what you want the truth to be, and then obfuscate from there, build from there. And I write in both starting places. I start with, okay, here's what I want the story to be. How can I give it twists and turns that are interesting? How can I, flesh this out in a way that is entertaining beginning to end and as a tempo and kind of builds. I also start with the other directions, and it could be at the micro level, it could be at a plot level, it could be just a story beat that I think is interesting, that can be the deception, that can be the twist, and then build from there. So I will probably just as often start from the lie, and then find the truth that fits onto that lie. So I start from both directions when I write stuff like that.
This is a much more general personal philosophy I have, is learn the rules and play by the rules so that you can master them, and then you should break the rules. And I think that's a pretty good way to think about things. Science, for example, is the exact same way. You learn the scientific rules, and then you think about how could you cheat or hack or break those rules in order to create something new, right? And that's the way I look, especially at art, is you learn the art rules, and then you break those to make new art. But great. I also think that's a great way to start. And if you are starting out writing, or if you're making D&D content, I guess that'd be a good first starting point, right? Know the end point, and that way you can be an architect to designing that structure and plot twists, versus, say, being like an archaeologist where you're discovering that plot as you write. So different approaches.
I like those two categorizations, and I take both of those approaches too, architect and archaeologist. And that's very similar to starting with the lie, using this framework of a red herring. I will sometimes take the archaeologist approach and then just ask questions. Okay, where does this character go? What's the logical conclusion for this? And then it feels as if I'm not the architect building the story. I am the archaeologist discovering the story, uncovering where does this make sense to go? Like it seems to be more revelatory rather than structural, rather than a conscious act of structuring.
And I think that beautifully gets right into what the next step would be. So if you do know what the solution is and you're starting there to make your mystery novel, you can start brainstorming and creating your own alternative theories for how you get there. And so for each theory, invent a different suspect. What would the motivation be? What clues would point to them? This is where you can really start developing those red herrings or those misdirections in what you're making. For instance, if the real killer uses a rare poison, your red herring might be that there's a chemist who has access to chemicals, or a gardener that works with toxic plants. You can input all of these. What's that one that my wife really likes, Breaking Bad? I haven't seen it. I always heard it's really good, but he's a high school chemistry teacher, right? And he has access to chemicals. So I don't know. Insert some red herring there if I had actually watched the series.
The Great Expectations example we talked about earlier, where the circumstances created the misconception for the characters, and so they just made the most natural assumptions. And I think that is another really good way to approach that idea, not just for creating red herrings, but just for creating twists and turns in stories and any writing that you're doing, is thinking from the character level. What would this person assume X, Y, and Z? What would they assume about this situation? What would they assume about the scenario? Why would they think that? And dig into the psychology of the character from there. And then, I, as the author, have, the top-down perspective of, well, obviously A follows B, therefore, but this character from the character's viewpoint would just assume X, Y, and Z. And then that's a very easy way to lay that out.
When an author does it really well, where they show, don't tell. And in this case, I would say step number 3 for adding the red herring to your project would be weave, don't shove. If we have the red herring be too obvious of a red herring, or be too authentic to the story, and authentic's not the right word, too misleading, I think it kind of builds towards a negative aspect. And so one of the ways you could have it is dialogue, having a character mention the suspicions or mention things. I feel like in Dostoevsky's The Idiot, he did a really great job of sometimes weaving in small nuances in the dialogue. Is this character going to die? Are these characters going to get together? And there's a lot of beautiful, slow weaving into the story. Although I wouldn't directly point to each one of those things that Dostoevsky talks about as red herrings, I still think that's a great example of how you weave in questions or possible hypotheses for where the story is going to go. Another idea would be like settings, where you put certain objects in the background. Maybe you have the narrator present something. When we look at films, right, we can really easily have subplots, B-plots, or things in the background the characters don't notice, right?
And you can play with a visual media like that. You could play with the perspective of characters, so within the story, but you could also play with what the viewer notices or fails to notice. You can use visual ambiguity, and you can use visual misdirections and clues. Everything from the subconscious level to the overtly conscious level that really creates that showing rather than telling, that weaving rather than shoving, which is a mark of very mature storytelling, but also very mature filmmaking.
Have you seen The Joker?
I have.
I think that's a really great example of the weave, don't shove, where you gently start seeing the perspective of the main character, and then you slowly start seeing like cracks in the reality where you're like, oh, did that actually happen, or was that his delusion? So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good example, because the filmmaking there brings you into the protagonist's viewpoint, and you are able to sympathize with the character, which from the outside, especially the character it's portraying, from the outside, that does not seem to be a character you could easily sympathize with or get in line with their viewpoint. But this completely subverts that, and that film does a masterful job of storytelling in that way.
And another way we've encountered storytelling is playing murder mystery parties. And when we play those, they're usually written such that most characters have some type of background. And that's another great way you could weave in these types of red herrings, where this gambling person has a debt, so they have like a motive for killing the person in the story. Or this person is desperate, or this person's being cheated on, and this person's in love, right? These background stories that can then be in their own way a nice setup to a red herring.
I think the interesting part about the way a murder mystery is written is that you have a treasure trove of data at hand, and you're your task as you are trying to figure it out is to find out what is relevant, so that you're going through the actual act of what's a misdirection, what's just flavor text, and what's relevant to what I'm pursuing here. Especially because the way most murder mystery parties are written is that the reveal of the murder happens part of the way through, and then so you have to piece together evidence on both sides of the reveal. So the introduction part, where you're role-playing your characters, you're getting to know other people's characters, you're gathering what would be useful, but then you don't have additional context to help you determine what's useful or not, because you don't know which character is murdered or not yet. Same thing with filmmaking and writing stories. That's also another way to kind of bury the lead, where you do get presented valid, relevant information before you're given the explanation of why it may be valid or relevant, which is a really easy structural way to switch it around, and then the subversion kind of takes care of itself.
And in that way, if we continue down that line, that kind of gets into the next step, which is to give your red herring weight and significance. If you just drop a clue and then never talk about it again, I suppose that might be a red herring and we can play with that. But I think mystery novels and mystery movies really benefit from kind of small pieces being dropped together that gives a certain red herring more weight. The butler wipes off blood, and he has like a handkerchief that he tucks into his pocket. You have no idea whose blood that is. Later, the butler just happened to show up, at a conspicuous time, right? Small little details or nuances. Or the butler accidentally scares the main character because the main character wasn't paying attention when they turned the corner, right? Like you're starting to add that significance to it. In terms of D&D, right, when you're trying to figure out, well, who should the murder hobos be trying to kill, right? You want to give them multiple pieces of evidence towards one direction or the other.
Mm-hmm. And that's another example of a different format, because you have to balance how on rails the story is, how on rails the story beats are, and how much is sandbox. And there's, that's a whole nother digression of how can you build in meaningful story beats with meaningful misdirections, depending on where on that spectrum your campaign or adventure falls. Is it how far into the sandbox side is it, where it's completely open world and they just pick a direction, you generate the material in that direction, or it's very on rails and you have a very clear, tight story beats that are followed. So different tasks in different situations. And I think the answer can be, in both of those situations, is character context and filling out characters, filling out backstories, and filling out motivations. If you're doing it from scratch, then opportunities just naturally present themselves for twists and turns and interesting story beats. If you are working with pre-built material, again, using the context of Dungeons & Dragons, role-playing games like that, you can... It just becomes a different creative task, at least for me, of taking what's there on the page, and I have like a radar that I have at all times of, okay, where's an opportunity for more fun or more interesting things to be added in, and where's an opportunity for me as a DM, I'm not excited about the material on the page, what can I do to spice it up?
You being the DM or someone being a writer, you have figured out the truth, either by starting with the truth or by discovering it as you flow through the plot yourself. You come up with reasonable, plausible alternatives. You gently drop all those clues in and you weave it into the story. And at least for some of them, you give it some significance so that it has weight behind it. But then finally, at some point though, you're going to have the reveal and the resolution. And this is where you can really create a lasting, beautiful piece of work, or really upset the reader or, players, whatever. The real solution, when it's revealed, it should not only expose the truth, but also explain all the red herrings. Why was the clue misleading? What really happened? Was the blood on the butler's sleeve actually jam instead? And this, I was struggling to find a good... Actually, we'll talk about it here in just a second. But sometimes you get the reveal or you get like the narrative and you're like, everything clicks together, right? It was like almost there and then it clicks together when you finally have the last piece of information versus that's the actual thing. That was dumb. Either because I felt like I didn't have a chance to actually guess the truth or because there were some bad applications of red herrings that we'll get into here in a second.
I think before we get into that, I think, what comes to mind there is most of the time when I have that experience, it feels like it's mainly due to poorly fleshed out motivations, poorly written motivations for characters that just don't make sense. Okay, this person was the killer, or this person did this, or this person took this action. And if you as the viewer or consumer are confused as to this person's motivation, that tells you that motivation didn't mesh with the character or the story. There wasn't a proper flow kind of smoothed out there to help you get to the same place the author intended.
I'm a sucker for a three-dimensional, believable antagonist. I hate when an antagonist is a straw man. They're just bad to be bad. The Shape of Water, I can't hate The Shape of Water more because the antagonist was nothing more than a plebeian straw man with no value whatsoever as an actual character. One of the ones I thought of was the movie Signs. When I watched it, it was like the aliens. It kind of felt hopeless. You have this extraordinary thing happening, and then at the end, the real problem was water. And I just thought the way the movie did it was super boring, and it left a bad taste in my mouth.
Why specifically did it leave a bad taste in your mouth?
I think because there was like no indication, there was nothing, and it also made it such a big, right? Alien invasion is like a existential level threat, and I just thought the idea of water was really poor because they're also walking through our atmosphere, which has humidity. And if they actually had that bad of a reaction to just a little bit of water being spilt on them, they would have been having constant bad reactions from the humidity in our air. And it just didn't logically flow for me.
So there was a logical implausibility there. So the big reveal for you was a problem just because of the sheer implausibility. If there was a technologically intelligent race advanced enough to actually invade, then how did they not figure out the water situation beforehand?
Right.
So it stretches the plausibility for you, is what you're saying. Mm-hmm. On the other hand there, to go back to what I was talking about, to me, I think you can boil that down to motivation. So maybe in that setting, that world, it makes sense. Okay, water is inimical to these alien creatures, but what's their motivation? Their motivation is not well pieced together because
it's never revealed.
Why? Well, just on the plausibility, you don't have to worry about the revelation or not. Just on the plausibility hiccup you're having, they're intelligent enough to get into Earth and invade and be a threat, but they're not intelligent enough to figure out the water problem before it's a problem. So, right there's a breakdown in motivations. How can you be intelligent enough to do the one but not figure out the other? So for me, it boils down again to motivation.
And that would be a logic problem. Another one I thought of was Jurassic Park 3, where the characters are figuring things out. The characters are they're having trouble, right? Dinosaurs, all this problem. And kind of towards the crescendo of the movie, you have the characters stuck in a impossible situation. They're about to die, and then all of a sudden, military helicopters come in and they get saved out of nowhere. In what I would call almost like a Deus Ex Machina format. And another example when I thought of that was one of the Superman movies. What's the female's name? Lois? No, Lorraine. Oh my gosh.
Lois Lane?
Lois Lane.
I believe her name is Lois Lane.
Yeah,
I'm
Lois
not
Lane.
super familiar with the Superman stories.
And in that one, Lois Lane dies, and then the solution was Superman just flies backwards fast enough to go back in time and save her. And it's just like that.
This is a movie?
Yeah.
Okay. I haven't seen this movie. I also haven't seen Jurassic Park 3.
Oh, okay. And those are the ones I had that I thought would be more popular. There was also like a Knives Out movie I saw, and I even forget which one it was, but that one was kind of boring to me because I thought the red herrings weren't believable. There wasn't enough credulity to them, but I was trying to avoid more niche examples.
How many Knives Out movies are there? I thought there were only 2. There's more?
I have no idea. I thought Knives Out was like a whole series.
Oh.
I could be completely wrong.
You could be wrong. It's always a possibility.
All right. What about you, Leo? Are there any bad red herrings you want to bring up?
The experience of, well, that wasn't fair. That solution, I never could have got that solution. That feeling of it not being fair. And I would say that my experience of the Sherlock Holmes stories is immensely enjoyable from beginning to end. There's never a time when I'm reading a Sherlock Holmes story that I'm not enjoying myself. But almost all the time, it feels like it's unfair. And sometimes I think that is at the structural level of the story. There's just not enough to glom onto. And other times I think the evidence is there for the reader to grab. And there is enough technically there to breadcrumb together to piece out the solution and arrive at it either before the character stories or at the same time as the character stories. But for me, it's not unfair in a way where I feel cheated. I know the general structure that's going to happen, and it's okay that I get outsmarted by Sherlock. It just makes sense. Because we are, in the Sherlock stories, we're almost always in the perspective of Watson, and we get his perspective. And I'm perfectly okay with that. So that would be an example of maybe the unfair kind of misdirection.
But a good unfair.
Unfair I'm fine with. I'm perfectly fine with that. But you are correct, and I think not Signs. Is it Signs, the alien one?
Signs.
Yeah, I think that is a good example of an unfairness that felt unfulfilling, that felt like I got cheated. Because I do remember that movie. I do remember just generally not liking the movie. I don't remember it well enough to tell you why, but you reminded me, and there's definitely a difference there in what makes it fair and unfair.
Yeah, when I was coming up with the research notes for this, one of the hard thing I had was like, where are more bad examples in books and movies for me? And my problem is like, I've forgotten most of those because I didn't like it, unless I really hated the movie. But most of the time I don't get to finish it if I really hate it. So it's like I struggle to come up with bad examples.
Right, and the misdirection is probably the least of your concerns when watching or consuming bad media.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay, so what else do we got left here? I mean, we talked about the Deus Ex Machina reveal that can be banal and boring. We talked about illogical red herrings. Let's see. Another one when I was reading through, what's that word? To reveal to you some of the stuff, like I also read through a lot of Reddit comments and things like that for this. And one of the ones I found, and maybe you can agree or disagree here, Leo, is that some people were complaining that the red herring is more interesting than the actual plot, and that people latched onto the red herring as a better plot than what ended up being the actual truth.
I have experienced that, and I just cannot come up with an example in my mind. Were you able to find some examples for this? Because I've had this experience of like, oh, the misdirection made more sense or is more enjoyable or believable than the actual solution. And sometimes that's done in a way where it follows that same feeling of being unfair and like, I feel like I got cheated. But sometimes that subversion is done in a way that is well done storytelling that feels fulfilling. So I've seen it done in both ways. But while I know that I've had that experience, examples are not readily coming to mind.
It's exactly what I had. Have you seen the movie Begonia?
I have not. That's a fairly newer one. Emma Stone, she gets kidnapped. No, that's something I've wanted to see, so don't spoil it for me.
I won't. All right, we won't talk about it. See, that's exactly the problem I had when I was trying to think of it. I was like, I know I've run into this, but I've forgotten them. Lost in the memories. If I think of it, I'll add it in here. The last one that I was reading about that people complained was the obvious to everyone but the detective red herring. The protagonist can be fooled. In fact, they probably should be fooled at some point, but they shouldn't look incompetent. If the average reader figures out the red herring in chapter 2 while the detective spends the next 300 pages chasing it, perhaps the audience loses respect and interest for the character. That's another one I heard people complaining about. And I guess in that case, you're just making it too obvious, but the character still struggles with it. Again, I can't think of an example, but this is something people on Reddit were complaining about in some of the books and movies. Feel free to disagree.
No examples are coming to mind of that specifically. The previous version of a red herring we were talking about that stands out to me is in The Dark Knight Rises, where Bane is made out to be the big bad, but then it's revealed there's a controlling force behind him. And I think that's a misdirection sometimes that makes sense in storytelling and can be done in both ways, the way that's fair and the way that's unfair, and the way that, you may have evidence for it, and then there's ways where it's just completely out of nowhere. So instead of a deus ex machina, that'd be an example of a devil ex machina, a demon ex machina, where, there's an even worse big bad behind the big bad. There's not really that big of a bad in comparison. Same thing, it's not a misdirection, but it's an interesting structural motif that Tolkien comes up with. If you read Lord of the Rings and then you read the Silmarillion, you realize that, Sauron was just a lieutenant for a much worse big bad, Morgoth. So that's a very interesting structure, because the main antagonist of the Lord of the Rings series ends up being only a lieutenant to a much darker, deeper evil.
I do like that reveal. The reveal when the person in charge is actually a puppet. I think we've seen that for the emperor is actually controlled by the eunuch, or the emperor is controlled by someone else, and the real evil person.
Right. And those aren't necessarily red herrings, but that's a form of, in a way, it can be a form of misdirection. Yeah, but it's also more so, like I was saying, reveals that happen towards the end, or twists that happen that don't follow that literary device of misdirection to fool the audience.
Great. I don't know how much more we could stretch the idea of a red herring. We have, in my opinion, Leo, taken the phrase red herring to the breaking point in every possible avenue we could today.
I agree. I don't know what else we can talk about with the red herring other than there's no actual fish called a red herring. It's just that's the color of smoked meat. Smoked fish.
Okay, and with that, let's bring this to a conclusion. This is a more unique episode for us because we know we didn't talk about a single book. We instead talked about an idea within books. And you know what? I would love if any of our listeners reached out to us and gave us their thoughts and opinions on this style.
Yep. And for ways to contact us, see the show notes. Many different ways to get a hold of us. We will happily read your comments, and, if it's good enough, we'll talk about it on air.
And with that, we'll be back next episode.
Bye, guys.